my talk today, and then hopefully in our discussion together, is what we can gain from relational pedagogies for both peace studies and then maybe also for peace building. And I want to use this moment to also provide a bit of reflection on some of the things that I've heard now all throughout this week. So I would like to divide my talk today into two main sections. I would like to start off with some assumptions and propositions as regards peace and peace studies and peace building. Not because I think they are fundamentally new. You'll see that many of the things I'm talking about have been discussed all throughout the week and in many ways are rather self-evident, but because I think it makes sense to at times also go back and think things from the bottom up. In the second part, I want to then ask what this means, these propositions, for teaching peace studies in higher education. So the pedagogical question in a more strict sense of the word. And here I will rely on the one hand on what we do at the Kroc Institute in our program, and at the same time also on my own and admittedly very often very anecdotal experience. Also, as a heads up, I tend to be terrible with timekeeping. So I have asked our moderator to please cut me off when we are at time so that we also have time for discussion. I ramble, what can I say? Alright, so where I would like to start before going to those 2 points, however, is sharing a couple of words about where I come from, the place I speak from, if you will. The concrete positionality at which I sit is a complicated one, as I think so many of them are. Now, I could start off with saying that it is, that's true, wonderful to be back, to be in Innsbruck, the place where I grew up and that I called my professional and personal home for such a long time, for so many years. If I look outside, then the mountains are calling me. Coming back, I also did not think that I would meet so many familiar faces from so many different contexts here. The safe spaces, the brave spaces, that particularly these conferences espouses, from my perspective also are relational spaces. And I firmly believe that it is the power and the vulnerability of those relations that in the end make possible alternative visions for what academia can be, what peace studies can be, and ultimately also what peace building can be. And then again, I could begin to tell the story of my positionality by pointing out the immediate aspects that have led me here. Peace studies is my vocation. I want to come back to this term. I have been teaching in this field for now almost 2 decades. It continues to inspire and to challenge me. I love my work, and at my heart of hearts, I probably am a teacher and a facilitator. Currently, I serve as the director for the graduate major in international peace studies at the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame. Our students come from all over the world, from the most diverse backgrounds, languages, religions, cultures, geographical areas. I think this is significant, as it is similar to many other programs in peace studies, and to a larger extent, I think it also defines what we do. I think it is the task of the university, not just mine, but in the end all universities, really, to be there for its students. Speaking for myself, sometimes I find I live up to this task, other times I think I fall short. But nevertheless, I think it should be our guiding principle. I could also begin the story of my positionality by saying that I'm a white, male, middle-aged and middle-class European, an Austrian who has emigrated from Europe to North America. I have therefore basically made that track that many settlers from Europe over the years, the decades and the centuries have made before me. And in that respect, of course, everything changes if I don't say North America, but if I say Turtle Island, how many of its original inhabitants would call it. The very place, city, university I live and work at is built on the unceded territory of the Pokemon band of the Potawatomi. Therefore, I cannot, and I think I should not really, claim neutrality or a sort of outsider perspective. I find myself always situated and implicated in a cartography of power, of privilege, in systems of structural inequalities, and of course also possibilities. What is more, at the particular historical moment we find ourselves in, it also needs to be mentioned that there are changes that are currently going on in the US, and here I think the term applies, that are happening at an unprecedented speed. As I am saying these words, Google Maps has already changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico to now also refer to it as the Gulf of America. While I am here in Austria at this conference, federal funding has just been pulled from DEI programs, gender programs, and programs in environmental justice all over the country, including my university, including my institute. USAID has basically been disbanded. And just yesterday, the US government decided to either drastically reduce or probably, in the end, disband completely the USIP, the US Institute of Peace. I teach peace studies in an international graduate program, and while I rely on my European passport to probably protect me, many of our students at this very moment are wondering and worrying about their visa status. Just today in the morning I found out that probably Fulbright funding might be put on hold, temporarily halted, which if it turns out to be true, would directly affect some of our students in our program coming from conflict countries, coming from countries at war. The current shift in US domestic and foreign politics will affect many conflicts and also many people across the globe, including, I think, many here in this room. And I might add, not just affect, but of course also affect differently. So my first point, if I'm allowed that, is that we need to understand now more urgently than ever how people are affected differently by changing global politics, by war and violence, because that's what we're studying. How some voices count and others do not count yet, and how we can change that. However, and this I think is already where it gets a bit tricky, I believe we also need to hold on to an understanding of connectivity, to an understanding of a, however defined, fragile, complicated and tenuous we, how we are not separate, how the very idea of separation and individuality can in of itself turn into a trap. How violence is that which separates. And how this very idea of separation is what allows us to believe that our peace could be unconnected to that of others, human and I might add non-human others. So my first point here is that I take relationality as an ontological category that points us to the underlying connectivity in the midst of the very real differences of lived situations. I think peace studies is also about holding those contradictory realities together without having to let them fall apart into dichotomies. Yesterday in the keynote lecture we heard about agonistic pluralism and pluriversality, and I find a lot of resonances in that. Alright, so you might now say, of course, that this maybe is a bit extensive in terms of positionality, and to some extent I think you would be right with that. However, I also do think that for peace studies, if that's what we're talking about, this is not just part of the background. This is not just part of the initial exercise that we do at the very beginning, but actually is rather close to the heart of what we are doing as scholars, practitioners, peace builders, and of course also as pedagogues, as teachers and facilitators. So this brings me to my first main section. I have 6 assumptions and propositions about peace and peace studies that I would like to put to you, some of them in echo and resonance to what we have discussed throughout the week. Again, I want to point out, you might say they are basic, granted, but basic can also mean to put the things we take to be fundamental back into discussion. Alright, so here goes. In line with, I think, what we discussed or briefly discussed yesterday in one of the keynotes, I would propose, not very surprising really, that peace studies is a normative, or maybe as I heard yesterday, a transnormative field. Because what we are talking about obviously is not just peace, conflict, violence, but I think is much more accurately described as peace building and conflict transformation or resolution, if you will, as violence prevention. So there is the normative aspects already inbuilt. So if this is a field that is valuing, then it comes with certain stances or commitments that maybe we define slightly differently, but still. So epistemologically and dialectically, pedagogically, I therefore can never claim to be a disinterested scholar, can never claim neutrality. But it is our task, my task really, to critically reflect on our assumptions and make them explicit and work from there. The question then that we also really touched in one of our discussions is how we can remain open to other normative systems, to opinions that we really disagree with. And I think that is not just a cognitive question, but in practice already is a fully relational one. Perspective taking, of course, has a cognitive component to it, no doubt about that. But it is equally, let's say, emotional and thematic. Particularly if and as we have normative assumptions that hearing, really hearing different opinions, listening to difference, are relational things, are relational qualities that have as much to do with our own state of receptivity and openness as they have with our cognitive capacities. So epistemologically, therefore, I'm wondering, and this is a constantly ongoing task, how we can go further in validating different ways of knowing, different ways of understanding, and different ways of touching, and therefore co-creating reality. Second point, and consequently, I assume that peace studies and the people who do it, for lack of a better word, want to make a difference in the world. I can see this with each new incoming generation of students, and if I'm honest with myself, of course it is also what has brought me to this field originally. We also know that this often leads to outcomes that might be as well-intentioned as they are repeating of colonial and universalist patterns. So we need to be aware of that. And still it is a fact that this is something we need to reckon with, and maybe much deeper than we have so far. Therefore, once more, we need methodologies that span the bridge, both in our teaching, but then also in our research, I think, between theory and practice. Understand theory as a form of practice, and thus in our pedagogies look to create spaces for training scholar practitioners. I thirdly want to follow those who propose to see peace studies and peace building as a vocation. I really think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we are seeing it just as a job. Of course it is that. There is no doubt about that. And at the same time, it is not just for many people, and I would imagine also for many people in this room. I know and I am at my best in what I do when I also try to live up to that potential that's included in the word. So I like this old-fashioned term of vocation, and not just because I'm teaching at a Catholic university. Yesterday, in one of the panels, somebody introduced themselves as a peace and conflict studies enthusiast. So for all those of you for whom vocation now sounds too preachy, then maybe enthusiast is a good alternative, in the sense of picking up those topics that we just cannot let lie. For my fourth proposition, I would like to go back to one of the discussions that was broached here, I think, in the plenary on Tuesday, about whether peace studies is an independent field, and want to suggest that it is an independent field on its way to becoming a discipline. Over the past 20-30 years, new undergrad, master and PhD programs have emerged in peace studies. Today, there is a growing number of scholars whose disciplinary background is not primarily anthropology, political science, economy, international relations, but who have been trained in peace studies and call it a scholarly home. I again think this is significant. The University of Innsbruck is just starting out with a new PhD in peace studies, so congratulations to that. And while peace studies for a long time has comfortably lived and grown in this interdisciplinary space, I think it's time that we ask ourselves what the consequences of such a potential shift could be, and how we once more can further systematize our methodological foundations vis-à-vis our partner disciplines. In a very pragmatic sense, I think this might offer new opportunities also for such questions as higher promotion tenure, which always are difficult and challenging. But I think it also could be urgent in order to avoid backlash and to protect these safe and brave spaces in case the overall political climate turns less favorable, which I am under the impression it increasingly does. My fifth proposition, again very basic, is to understand peace building as a multi-dimensional, multi-level and long-term process. In peace-building processes, what happens, we all know this, for example, at the communal, the societal, at the global level, is not separated, obviously, but is intrinsically interrelated. The personal, the relational, the cultural, the structural dimensions are always equally present. Social justice, reconciliation, or social healing also are not really measured in months, but rather in years and frequently in decades. My all-time inspiration, Jean-Paul Lederach, said it beautifully and metaphorically just a couple of years ago when it comes to the underlying attitude that this requires of peace builders. The ox is slow, but the earth is patient. There again is a relational point to that has to do not just with what we understand cognitively, but our attitude and the relational qualities that we bring to our work. Now to contrast that, one of the slogans that is currently going around in the US, and again that US applies here as a term, not Turtle Island, that comes from the tech scene and is exemplified by Elon Musk's new office is move fast and break things. There is a potential for violence that is inherent to this attitude, and I think it is important to signal that and to point it out. Now, having said that, I am of course also aware that it unfortunately seems to be true that things are undone, broken, much faster than they are rebuilt. The consequences of what is happening or has been happening in the past month and what we are currently witnessing in the US will occupy all of us, I think, for years to come. We need to be prepared for that. Last proposition, peace as a process, also means in the end that peace is about engaging with difference. Peace then is not about agreeing, it's not about consensus, but always and always only about the question of how we deal with difference. maybe, if you have followed me so far, maybe mindful of the underlying connectivity that is also there. And it is in this sense procedural, as I think Ian Mansey has pointed us to wonderfully in his keynote on Monday. And it is a process that very often is not comfortable, but is hard. And just also state my own opinion here, I do think peace building is in the end, we don't make peace with friends, but we do make peace with enemies. So alright, now this brings me to my next point, relational pedagogies in peace studies. Now what does all of this mean in light of our teaching? Here I again have 6 points for how I translate that into the teaching and facilitation that I'm part of. How the underlying question that I'm starting from is here, how and to which extent can our programs also be transformational spaces where we get to practice that which we are talking about. So my first proposition is that I try to aim for a combination of theory and practice. So this notion of the scholar practitioner once more. How we integrate practice spaces into our teaching, into our curricula, both in terms of local and community engagement in the classroom. I once more want to call back Ian Mansey's keynote lecture on Monday, which was excellent in that respect, but then also as spaces within the classroom in which students get to practice relational skills with each other. This relates for me also to the previous epistemological question, which knowledge do we value, how it is gathered. If we position ourselves at the interstices of scholarship and practice, then which methodologies speak to this? And to just look at what we have had here in the past week, I want to point to this wonderful idea of duo ethnography that Rina Aluria and Susan Mendes gave us. At our program, we also do send our students on 6-month field placements with peace-building organizations. In the end, I think it is a question of radically enlarging what is considered academic in terms of methodology. Which language does our research speak? How is it gathered? By whom? And for whose benefit? So the second point then that goes together with that is critical reflexivity. What Paulo Freire such a long time ago has called conscientization as a critical and relational thinking, living, acting also in our classrooms. So, and for me these are logical consequences of this notion of positionality and ethical normativity, both of which require an ongoing reflexivity, not just about what the own assumptions and values are, but also what they are based on and what potential consequences are for how we localize ourselves along these intersecting lines of powers. So in the end, it's not just scholar practitioners, but maybe reflective scholar practitioners that we seek to train, educate, facilitate the learning of. Thirdly, I would say the comprehensive learning. Andreas Goldbach will be very happy to hear that I'm not saying holistic learning here anymore in that respect. I would propose a comprehensive learning that speaks to the whole person, that speaks to knowledge, skills, and qualities. I mean, the obvious point is again that as part of a higher education setting, learning has to be to some extent, maybe a large extent, include theory and concepts. I think that's clear. Our students need to understand the premises that peace studies build upon, the current debates. They need to have the analytical and conceptual maps that allow them to understand a conflictive situation and where possible points of intervention might lie. I don't think that in this aspect peace studies really differs a lot from other fields of studies and other disciplines. But then again, insofar as you are still with me and maybe have at least to some extent agreed to what I've said so far, then it is obviously that theoretical and analytical maps are not enough. At least at Kroc, and I think at many other graduate level peace studies program across the world, including I think here in Innsbruck, we are interested in training future peace builders. requires these relational skills and qualities that I would argue are at least as important and therefore need a corresponding space in our syllabi, but more one step back in our curricula. A long time ago, Adam Curl has spoken about this, I think still today, radical notion of non-instrumental befriending as one of the key skills of a peace builder. Non-instrumental befriending. I still find it very radical. And I still think it's poignant today. Okay, alright, thank you. Fourth proposition. I think I'll be fine. Fourth proposition. Translocality. I borrowed this concept of translocality in its concrete definition here from Dong Jin Kim and Duncan Morrow. Now, to get to the heart of the matter, really, here's an observation that is in part empirical and I admit to a large part anecdotal. When we ask our alumni, sometimes also decades later, about what the significant learning during their times in peace studies have been, what almost invariably shows up on the very top is that they think they have learned the most from their cohort, from the relational encounter with each other, from the engagement, the relational engagement with difference. That does not say that these encounters have always been easy. Many of our students point us, and alumni point us to the fact that they at times have been rather challenging. And yes, uncomfortable, no doubt about that. But still, this is where people feel that this is the most significant learning for them, again, also many years later. And once more, I assume that this doesn't just go for the programs that I've had the privilege to be in contact with over the years, but I assume, with the very anecdotal evidence I have, that this is shared across the field. So just out of curiosity, just because I have such a wonderful sample here, is anybody, can I get a show of hands? Anybody who has made a similar experience, either as a student or as a faculty member or administrator? All right, so yes. Good. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for your participation. And the simple point here is that obviously as we, including us as facilitators, are sitting in the classroom just as when we are engaged in practical piecework with concrete others, our stories always sit with us at the table. And yes, those stories are many. So throughout the conference, we've had ample evidence from experiences of teaching and learning in different circumstances, in conflict areas, and with people for whom what is discussed in the classroom is directly and immediately relevant for their lives. Yesterday, here in this forum, in the other room, we heard about pluriversality, decoloniality, and intersectionality as some of the threads that basically have also been running through this conference. So what we are trying to do, basically, in our, and I think in many other programs, is to create relational spaces where people can meet, where students can meet and get in contact with each other, where they can practice authenticity, listening, and of course at times also drawing boundaries and disagreeing, and then rubbing up against those boundaries. This happens in the classroom space, but not just. Ultimately, I think there is a type of learning that doesn't sit well in these type of settings. It doesn't sit well in the classroom, but needs different venues. So here once more my ongoing questions: how can we stretch the boundaries of the university to make space for different types of relational engagement and learning? I, for example, facilitate dance and body practice on a voluntary basis. We go on retreats with our students where the only topic is what people bring. I think our task as teachers really is to be facilitators of learning, and that requires open spaces, not unbounded ones, but open ones. So trans-local in the sense that when somebody speaks about their experiences, they remain the locus of authority for that. And later on, we as learners can ask ourselves collectively what we can take from that, what we can learn from that, without, however, pretending that what works in one context can automatically be transposed to another. So, safe spaces and brave spaces are also spaces of encounter and reflection. Fifth proposition, and I'm almost at the end, is cooperation. The type of learning I seek to espouse and foster is cooperative rather than competitive. This is a question not just of how we teach, but basically what we value, really. For example, in academia, raising hands and speaking up in class. And also, how do we grade? The question then becomes, can we also value silence, listening, presence as forms of participation? And then, of course, this I think is where peace building and peace studies really overlaps. How do we then distinguish such an active silence from one that is being silenced? Which is a crucial point. So how do we validate different forms of participation that are not based on who speaks more or who writes the better paper, but rather on what we can accomplish together? I think this is important, particularly when the overall mood is so competitive and individualizing as academia all across really very often tends to be. All right, and this almost brings me to the end. So the last point then is, of course, that this needs to be in many ways, or what I would like is something that's person-centered, that sees learners as both capable and responsible in a relational sense, that understands that learning is not a one-way street where, to want to go back to Frere, teachers fill empty vessels, but a joint undertaking. That while putting all of us in different positions of power and hierarchy, also is one in which we, I think, ultimately can only succeed together. So nothing of what I have said here today is really new or is really mine. But I hope that the reminder is timely, because we finally also have to recognize the fact that those safe spaces and brave spaces need to be constantly maintained and protected, because they also are fragile and easily lost. And I do want to say that I think that the hour is late and the moment is dire. So I want to then finish with another reminder to myself and to whom it may concern, an invitation to remain open, vulnerable and caring learners, especially in these times of collapse, of closing and hurt for so many of our communities across the world. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Norbert, for the presentation. I guess in true spirit of relationality, I guess we can now open the floor for whoever feels invited to share their passions, thoughts, ideas, and actually make this a conversation. Andreas.
Thank you so much. If I may borrow also from a Catholic vocabulary, let me start with a confession. I have to confess that there is a specific reason why we suggested that you would hold the last keynote, because I knew that you are an able dancer and that you would spiral around all the relevant topics that were part of our different panels, plenaries, keynotes, and at the same time bring something new also to our discussion. Thank you so much for that. I have also a question. When it comes to, let's say, the ontology of connectivity and relationality, I wonder, thinking also of this violent dream of Elon Musk to dissociate ourselves from this planet, to turn us into a multi-planetary species and to eventually colonize Mars, leaving billions of people behind to die, and not just people. I wonder how would you make sense of this art of connecting, not least to the planet Earth, with all its beings, because on the one hand we know historically that there's a tendency of understanding this connectivity in terms of an extreme autochthony, meaning that we bond too much so that there's only space for us here and for no one else, no other being. Or at the same time, the other extreme is to completely disband any kind of connection, saying, well, it's not really relevant for us, we could live in the outer space, at least imagine as a form of imagination. So I wonder, how would you make sense of this art of connecting with each other?
Can I answer right away? Okay, great. I think that's a fantastic question. My usual answer tends to be beware of dichotomies and either-ors, right? So usually the interesting space is the in-between space. So obviously also a relational ontology cannot be posited in an absolute sense, once more, because then we're just repeating the very same exclusionary tendencies that we have just tried to overcome on a much larger sense. And I really take great heart here from this notions of pluriversality, really. Because on the one hand, pluriversal proposals very often are deeply relational, and they also understand the multiplicity, the complexity, and the contingency of all these ontological proportions. And I think in that contingency there is maybe a hope that we can work around the violence of the either-ors. Yeah. So therefore we obviously don't remain open to an unlimited extent, and an unlimited space is not safe either. But maybe we can work this very, very careful and changing balance of also ontologically from in between.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and I'm really glad to hear many things that, as an outsider in peace studies, I kind of concluded myself. So I'm glad to see that in a way, I am starting to do well as an educator. But I do have a question concerning, because I understood a lot about the teaching process. And I have some questions about, which are always in my mind, also discussing with colleagues, educators, about the assessment. Recently I've been in another conference in which there was this proposal from a Swedish lecturer of, she basically eliminated the assessment process and she substituted it only with formative assessment. And I am a huge supporter of formative assessment, but the moment that I discuss about these things with my colleagues, then of course the administrative burden becomes a question. But it was quite interesting to see that she was basically describing the process of assessing and reducing to a number as the symbol, in a nutshell, of neoliberal principles, which are basically nourishing competition instead of promoting collaboration. So I wanted to ask you if you have an idea of how to solve this, because on the other hand, students keep, of course, reminding us that at the end of the day they need a number to move on, and if they want to move to higher studies, they will be asked always that number. So that's the first part of my question. The second part of the first part, sorry. The second part is concerning the role of the lecturer. Because I completely agree with the idea of becoming vulnerable also as a lecturer. I agree very much. And therefore also kind of blurring the line between teaching and being in collaboration with the students. But I was also, yesterday in a round table, I was also raising this question that I myself have been educated in Italy and I teach in the Netherlands. And I find myself in the combination of two philosophies of teaching, historically, I mean. And what I do see is that the students themselves sometimes ask me to not to go too far into becoming friends, because they basically don't perceive anymore the line of the depository of the foundational knowledge in the process. And they don't want to lose this sense of trust in the lecturer. So I wanted to ask you a bit an opinion about these boundaries and how we can solve these on the long term. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think both of those questions actually go into the same direction, right? And because we work in certain structures that also call us to occupy certain positions of hierarchy and certain positions of power, really, that we can't just pretend don't exist. And if we do pretend they don't exist, I think we run into deep trouble. I don't think that would be authentic either. There is some at least from my again anecdotal experience, there is some leeway on how we play this. There is some maybe subversive potential that's relational. That's not a pre-given thing on what we can do with and as part of a concrete group. And yes, particularly if we work with international groups, then there are those which will actually ask for a little bit more of guidance, which actually ask for a little bit more of input and which are quite comfortable with the hierarchies. And we can be pushed at a little bit, but not overwhelm them with wanting to become friends. And then there are groups which are more comfortable playing in this open space. But if we are serious about really trying to place the locus of authority more with the students, then I think it should come from the concrete field of the group within the overall structure of what we have at our availability that we can't just ignore. Yeah? And in any case, for me, a good point here is to be authentic. Because it's not the same. We're not on a level playing field. That's very clear. And we also have a responsibility to provide a certain amount of input. We can't abrogate our responsibilities as teachers to the extent that we're just friends who hold the space. I think that's too limited. And then it becomes a process which really, for me, the key point is the relational openness. And to understand who am I in this concrete situation and who am I with. And then the second point, the permanent question, of course, welcome to universities, is assessment. It gets reduced very often to a grade, right? And we can work against that, and I think to some extent we should, but it doesn't change the fact that it is like that at the current moment. Again, I think there's different ways of playing with that. Because I think it's completely legitimate that the world being the way it is, students also have a legitimate need to get a degree and to get a grade that then allows them to do other things. Right? So this also empowers them to do certain things. And so in our radicalness, we also have to take that into consideration. And I know my university always tells me, great inflation, you can't give everybody an A. Well, this is really where it gets a bit tricky for me. But how do we put the question of assessment more into the background? How do we, in our pedagogies, set it up that students understand that this maybe is a space where they can practice a skill that they will need again, but that is not immediately threatening, at least for the spaces that we hold? And how can assessment then become maybe a collaborative process? Now, very pragmatically, I like asking our students to basically assess themselves, and as a principle, if at all I raise, I don't go lower, and also point out that if you assess yourself, please take your whole being into consideration. It's not just about how often you raised your voice in class, but it is about, and you know that better than anybody else as a learner, how active was I really in the sense of my presence? Did I really do what was possible for me at the moment in the concrete circumstances that I am? Take your whole lived situation into consideration as you do this assessment. It's not just about the class, but about the larger position that you find yourself at. And sometimes there's more possible, and for others who have many different obligations at the same time, less is possible. And that, I think, if we're really talking about a comprehensive teaching, not a holistic one, then I think all of that sort of needs to be taken into consideration as well. And to the extent to which that's possible, I try to do that, understanding that it's never a complete autonomy, really.
I would say we can take 2 more questions, or 3 if you're really short in formulating it, and you're very short as well to answer that, so that we can keep track of the time.
Hello, good morning, and thank you very much for the presentation. I just want to bring in also a different point of view, always related to relational pedagogy, the practice of peace building. I'm very comfortable to be in this context in the academia and the big creation of knowledge. I come from the practice. I've been a practitioner. I work with projects. I work in realities. And I find that within this context and in our creation of knowledge at the academia, I am missing the practice of peace building. And it's a way of saying thank you for all this good food of thought, but I would like to have a little bit of this connectivity with realities, because when I go back to realities, I give, let's say, a different example. Bosaso, Somalia, when I need to create this peace-building understanding in my own pedagogy. I find it that here I'm missing a bit of that kick that needs to come in to create this critical thinking also in the academia. And when we use the reflecting tool of peace practices is where academia should be there, because we can co-create knowledge. So thank you. That was my message.
I think the point, I mean, I can be extremely short here. I think the point is very well taken, and I agree with everything you said. So yes, I think this is part of where we are at. And to give the academic argument once more, is part of the question of how we do our research methodologies. Because if they're supposed to be practice-oriented, then it requires a much more of a going out. And it requires a much more of an understanding how to engage with concrete people in very concrete circumstances. Yes to everything you said.
I will try to be short and not too much emotional. I'm not sure I will make it. Thank you. Simple thank you. I'm a teacher, not from peace studies. And your words about remain open, vulnerable learners, and create safe space and brave space and relational space. I think it's very valuable for teachers all over the world, independently from the field. And I thank you that you vocalize it. I think your students are extremely lucky to have you. I would love to be your student.
I'm not sure if all agree with
you. My question is, first of all, my huge gratitude for this speech and for all your thoughts. One of your sentences, one of your many sentences, but now I'm thinking about it, that peace building at the end is to make peace with enemies, not with friends. Can you give us an example maybe from your life when you managed it? Thank you.
Yeah, that sentence actually doesn't come from me. Just a year and a half ago, we had the former Colombian president Juan Manuel Santos, who was engaged in the Colombian peace process, and who had made peace with the FARC at the Kroc Institute, and that's what he said. He said, at one point I had to sit down with those people I violently disagreed with. And he said, when the doors were closed and everybody else outside of the room, they told me that while we were having our negotiations, that they would still try to kill me if they would find the chance for that. Yeah. And these are the people I need to somehow engage engage with. And these are the people that of course we don't just disagree with, but if possible we would like to capture and kill each other. And still, once the doors are closed and the cameras are gone, if we don't find some way of at least talking to each other, nothing moves. So that's you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And to make it more personal, maybe, again, I don't have such an example, but I know this from myself. I mean, really, the people I really need to engage with are the people I don't want to engage with. It's not that I think that peace is wonderful, you are my enemy, and now we hug each other, no. It is exactly in those moments, I don't want to talk to you, seriously. I do not want to engage with this. That's the point of peace building. This is deeply personal and deeply relational, and also usually very intimate.
Norbert, perhaps any last words from the side?
I think I've said all the last words that I already had. Again, thank you very much for being here. Once more, thank you to the organizers, and I hope we take the next steps, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a short housekeeping announcement. We are going to reduce our task force at the reception desk